I was having this conversation recently that if I could distill down to a question, would be something like, how much of the existing housing shortage is down to exclusionary zoning? And the way I'd answer that is, yes, just not in the way that you're probably thinking. But in that conversation, it also occurred to me that a lot of people conflate affordable housing with apartments. Some people conflate it in the negative sense of like, apartments, ew, poor people. But then other people conflate it in a presumed positive sense of something like, poor people, yay, apartments.
We know that nationally there's a shortage of 5 to 6 million units, or roughly equivalent to every house in Pennsylvania. The problem in trying to figure out just how much of the housing shortage has been caused by exclusionary zoning is that the housing shortage doesn't really manifest as a national problem. There is no housing shortage in Pittsburgh or Memphis or Detroit. Rather, the problem manifests as 30 to 40 regional problems of differing degrees. So, what is this exclusionary zoning? Well, funny you should ask, because I recently had the exact same question. I was at the APA Florida conference in Tampa back in September, and I deliberately attended this talk on inclusionary zoning. Silly me, I went in there thinking that this was going to be a conversation about land development codes and creative ways to guarantee greater housing diversity from your zoning code. But the conversation wasn't about zoning at all. It was about the successes and failures in requiring developers to include a certain percentage of affordable housing in their projects. I wasn't the only one confused. And one of the women on the panel, who was the only planner on the panel and the only one who was based locally, Gainesville to be precise, she kept defaulting to the term inclusionary housing because in that context, at a planning conference, inclusionary zoning didn't make any sense. But here's the problem. Housing type doesn't tell you a lot about affordability. A 3-bedroom apartment here in downtown Orlando will rent for about $4,300 a month, while this 3-bedroom, 2-bath house about a mile away rents for about $2,700 a month. And yeah, I know it's funny me saying that I'm here in downtown Orlando dressed like this, but it is 40 degrees outside and it's really windy. It's pretty cold. Inclusionary zoning tries to ensure, at least as a long-term strategy, that a wide range of housing types are available at a wide range of price points. Inclusionary housing, on the other hand, tries to use a wide range of carrots and sticks to get developers to take tax breaks or other monetary incentives to include subsidized units in projects that they were already planning on building. Inclusionary zoning and inclusionary housing are both important and needed, which is why it's important not to conflate the two. There are two different concepts at play here, which we'll get into in more detail in a few minutes, but that is attainable housing versus affordable housing. Housing affordability is generally defined as a household spending 30% of their income or less on housing. So with that in mind, attainable housing is housing that's affordable to households earning between 80 and 120% of the area median income. Affordable housing, on the other hand, is housing that's affordable to those earning 80% or less than the median. If you want to learn more about zoning, I did a deeper dive here. Exclusionary zoning is generally understood as using zoning to exclude apartments and even townhomes from large swaths of a city or even a metro area in favor of detached single-family housing. This isn't just a widely understood professional term, it's a widely understood legal term. The off-cited Mount Laurel decisions deal with the concept of writing certain housing types out of your code. The idea is that you exclude people of varying incomes by excluding the types of housing that would be affordable to them. This, of course, doesn't just mean that in the extreme case that the working class can't afford to live in your neighborhood. It also means that your kids who just graduated from college can't afford to live there either. This is the common understanding of exclusionary zoning, so that's how I'm going to address it here, but it really depends on the context. The same housing products don't exist in every market, so if you're in Philadelphia or Omaha or Sacramento, exclusionary zoning can have different meanings. But in order to see how we got here, we need to go back to the beginning for a minute. The suburbs had been the near exclusive domain of the wealthy from the late 1600s through to the 1880s when the electric streetcar was invented. Innovations in transportation technology coincided with rising incomes to make the suburbs more accessible to the middle classes. But the wealthy didn't necessarily like that and could afford to leave the middle class behind and move to even more exclusive places, and began doing that almost as soon as the electric streetcar was invented. By the 1920s, we had books about the rich and less famous living in the then far-flung suburbs of Long Island. And by 1940, we had movies based on stories from the 1920s that depict the only slightly less wealthy on the main line in the Philly suburbs.
Sure. The prettiest sight in this fine, pretty world is the privileged class enjoying its privileges.
But the era of exclusivity didn't end with the wealthy. It was conventional wisdom for the middle class in the 1950s through to the 1980s that restricting housing to their group would keep the riffraff away. There was a widely accepted false cause fallacy going on that associated density with both lower incomes and crime. A surprising number of people still believe it to be true. It isn't. The experts have always known the density causes crime fallacy to not be true, but the experts are mere cogs in the process and are known to bow to the whims of the mob, even when the mob is dead wrong. Density doesn't cause neighborhoods to decline, and a few bad apples don't typically ruin a neighborhood. The truth is that most neighborhoods decline because housing usually slides downhill. Okay, not literally downhill, but rather in the absence of major cash infusions for renovations and expansions, it moves downward in a process known as filtering. Most of the middle-class suburbs being built right now are the rough and tumble neighborhoods of 2090. But it's not the actual neighborhoods that are going downhill. It's the housing stock in the neighborhood. If you have 300 homes all built in the same year, in the absence of regular infusions of cash for upkeep, they will all be showing their wear 50 years from now. Houses get old and the technology in them ages even faster. Houses need expensive electrical upgrades every 30 to 40 years, new plumbing, kitchens and bathrooms, HVAC, window replacements, roof replacements every 20 years or so. 15 years ago, no one had even thought about having an electrical outlet with a built-in USB port, but now they're everywhere. 15 years ago, hardly anyone was thinking about charging an EV at home, but now it's common. A flowchart is worth at least 1,000 words, and this one gets it done. It's showing the market supplying housing that's affordable to the moderate and high-income households. It's showing the quality slide that houses go through, but it's also showing through the process of renovation that not all housing slides down very far, and some doesn't slide at all. Most of it does, though, and that becomes housing that's affordable to households around and just below the median, as well as for the working class. Broadly speaking, the bottom 10 to 20% of households need some form of state-supported housing because there's no way that the market could provide that. And the demolition renovation graphic on the right is important, and looked at another way, neighborhoods built for the wealthy and upper middle class tend to feature larger homes and better quality construction. They also tend to get near constant maintenance and frequent upgrades. As long as location is right, these neighborhoods tend to resist sliding very far through the filtering process. Basically, if you're building enough middle-class housing today, you'll have enough housing in 30 to 40 years that's affordable to the lower middle and working classes. And this process of filtering works the same for houses as it does for apartment buildings. Yes, when dealing with an acute housing shortage, building a lot of apartments brings more supply to the market faster. But ultimately, it doesn't matter what the housing type is. You can rent a house just as easily as you can an apartment. What ultimately matters for housing affordability is that there are enough units for everyone who wants one, plus a little extra. This housing in Memphis is affordable to most households. To be clear, yes, absolutely, single-family suburbia is NFG for low-income households because, in relative terms, cars are expensive and they put an enormous transportation cost burden on households that can't afford it. What ultimately matters for overall housing affordability, though, is the total number of units relative to demand. The point here is that the filtering process checks out. And would be mostly sufficient for our housing purposes, except we haven't been building enough housing. Hopefully, everyone understands that for the last 40 years, our population has been growing a lot. If you live in the eastern half of the country, picture Pittsburgh or Charlotte. If you're in the western half, picture Portland or Sacramento. I'm talking the whole metro areas, the cities, and all the suburbs. Now, imagine having to build that amount of housing every year or every other year. That's the demand for housing we've had from population growth nearly every year. The lack of inputs into the housing filter isn't the beginning and end of it. It gets worse. Our household size has also been declining. Here's where some people get a little lost over terms, so I'll explain. Household size doesn't refer to the size of the house. It refers to the number of people living in the houses. Back in 2000, the US population was 282.2 million, and by 2024 was approximately 342 million. If average household size was still 3.4 like it was in 1960, then we would need 100.6 million units of housing to house today's population. But in 2000, household size wasn't 3.4. It had fallen to 2.59. But now it's 2025, and household size has fallen again to 2.57. So now we need over 133.1 million units of housing. Yes, a decline of 0.02 in household size has created demand for another 1 million units of housing. Ironically, this is a problem of affluence, and it's happening all over the world, which is also driving up the cost of construction materials. More people can afford to live alone, so they are. To recap, we've added almost 60 million people over the last 24 years. And since the average household size has fallen from 2.59 to 2.57, that means that we've needed to grow our housing stock by over 23.3 million units to house all of those people. That's the equivalent to the entirety of the housing stock in California, Oregon, Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. All the houses. That's nuts. And it's not just nuts, it's completely unsustainable. And while we needed to add 23.3 million units, we actually added 28.5 million units. Okay, so we built 5 million more units of housing than we need. So what's the problem? Well, that's not nearly enough to make up for the deficit we were already in. All of this housing is essentially missing. And it gets worse. Of course, that housing gap began during the liquidity crisis and the global financial crisis that it spawned, but it wiped out nearly half of all home builders, with only the biggest firms with the deepest pockets making it through to the other side. It gets worse. There's second home ownership to deal with as well. Second homes account for around 4.6% of the total housing stock in the US. This might seem like a lot, but it's actually on the low end for developed countries. In Spain, for example, second homes make up almost 15% of all housing units. And before you go thinking that it's all wealthy foreigners who own those homes in Spain, almost a quarter of all Spanish households report owning a second home. In the US, it's been around that 5% mark for decades. And it's a stubborn number. When the national housing stock was 50 million units, then 5% was 2.5 million units. But now that we're around 130 million units, that 5% is 7.3 million units. So yes, 1 out of every 20 units that get built are going to be a vacation home for someone. But those vacation homes aren't distributed evenly. States like Vermont and Florida have a higher than average percentage, while states like Ohio and Nebraska have a lower than average percentage. And there's more. It's moving day. If you're American, moving day happens on average once every 5 years. That means on any given day in the US, some 72,000 households are moving house. They can't move to a place that someone else is living in. If it's an apartment, it will typically be empty for a few weeks for painting and renovations in between tenants. Houses for sale can be vacant for just as long, if not longer. If there's not a surplus of housing, it becomes difficult to near impossible to move because there are no empty places to move to. It's generally understood that this vacancy rate needs to be at or above 5% for the market to work in favor of renters or buyers. Once it falls below 4%, it's very much a landlord's market. So, in addition to all of the vacation property built into our housing supply, nationally, we need somewhere in the ballpark of 7 million units that are vacant, but otherwise on the market. Every year, we lose a lot of housing to floods, fires, wind, earthquakes, and just general obsolescence. There's a lag between these events and data collection on them, but best estimates are around 300,000 units per year, average. Hurricane Katrina alone wiped out 800,000 units in 5 days. About 250,000 homes were permanently destroyed, and around 550,000 were uninhabitable for months and even years in some cases. So even if we had no increase in the number of households, we still need a built-in excess of around 300,000 units every year just to maintain. But that's at today's numbers. The more housing we have, the bigger the target, so the number of houses we lose every year also grows. We know we haven't been building enough housing. We know that puts upward pressure on rents, and we can see pretty clearly that when rents go up, that the brakes get put on household growth. Yes, that means that household size is growing again, not because people want to, but because they don't have a choice, even though people living alone is actually one of the biggest contributors to the problem. Note the jump in the rate of household growth 20 years after the baby boom. It's not surprising, it's just indicative of how the process works. A bunch of kids are born, 20 years later they want their own place. Slowing household growth isn't a bad thing per se, but there are only so many people who can live with their mom or their brother forever. If you're not building enough homes for everyone, you have a problem. We're almost done explaining that problem. Almost. So while all those other factors are in play, we have the added problem that most immigrants and most college grads are headed for the same 30 metro areas. That's why I said in the beginning that this is less of a national problem than it is a bunch of regional problems. Or at least that's the way it started. To expand on that idea, local rents come down to this. Take all of the income and all of the assets available to all the residents of a region, and then divide that by the total number of housing units available. The larger the quotient, the more expensive your housing. When you have a bunch of domestic high earners, and then a bunch of immigrants, many of whom are also high income, all flocking to the same few metro areas, it's a recipe for a housing disaster. If you took all of the second homes, and then all the homes that were vacant because they're on the market, or because someone died recently, or because there was a fire, or a flood, or damage from an earthquake or a hurricane, then nationally we should have a vacancy rate in the ballpark of 12%. But it's actually more like 9.5%. And that 2.5% difference represents almost 3 million units of housing, or roughly the entirety of all of the housing in Indiana. And as I've been saying, the vacant units we do have right now are mostly not where the jobs are. The feds could do something about that. They could create tax incentives for businesses to move to certain metro areas. They could tie immigration like Australia does to residents in a certain area for a certain period of time. You want to live in the US and work in construction or nursing? Northeast Ohio will be your new home for the next 5 years. Hey, at least it's not Detroit.
It could be worse though, at least we're not Detroit! We're not Detroit!
Those are a few of the ways that the housing shortage manifests. There are other reasons that housing could be more expensive. The fact that there's a shortage allows those other factors to have an outsized influence on price. The lack of builders means less competition and fewer new units on the market. Construction materials have gotten a lot more expensive over the last 2 decades. Foreign and institutional investors bid up the price. While those things may contribute to the demand side, they're not the primary causes of the shortage. And in many cases, they are but mere symptoms of the crisis, a crisis of low supply and high demand. The biggest contributors to demand are rapid population growth, the continuation of rural to urban migration, and now urban to urban migration that has more and more people clustering in fewer and fewer megacities, and, of course, declining household size. What also had a huge effect on demand were low interest rates that made borrowing cheap and pumped trillions of dollars into the property market. And on top of that, all of that money coming into the market for over a decade didn't create a flood of new housing. What it actually did was pump up the price of the existing housing stock instead. And that was primarily because the home building industry was hollowed out by the Great Recession. And none of that even touches what printing $13 trillion over the last 4 years has done to inflation. Inflation is up around 22% since 2020. I don't know about you, but I'm not making 22% more than I was 5 years ago. In the next video, we'll tackle a few final problems and some potential solutions. If you'd like to see that when it comes out, don't forget to click subscribe and ring that notification bell. I'm Jim. This is Urban Legends. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.